Hi, my name is Ryan Duffin. Like Mike said, I am a senior animator at EA DICE in Los Angeles. I've been doing game animation since 2001. I wish I'd put together a little credits page like Mariel did, but I didn't. I worked on games like Spider-Man 2, Alan Wake, Killzone 2, Battlefield 3, Medal of Honor Warfighter, most recently Battlefield 4 Premium. So my talk is titled, Using the Power of Layered Animation to Expand Premium Content in Battlefield 4, which might be one of the longest talk names at GDC, and I'm sorry about that. I'm already sick of saying it. We're going to be talking about layered animation, additive animation, and state machines. I know you've heard a bit about that today already, and I'm going to be hopefully going into a little more detail in the context of an actual feature. So this is going to be about a little bit high level at the beginning, and then we'll get to all that. So this is the story of an upcoming actual feature in the Battlefield 4 Dragon's Teeth expansion pack. That's the one coming up after the current one, and one that was very dependent on its technical implementation. The original talk that I was signed up to do was about additive and layered animation, but during that time I found myself working on this feature, and I thought if I actually had permission to work on, to talk about this feature a little bit before it was announced, then the talk would pretty much write itself. I got permission. Unfortunately, the talk won't read itself, so that is what I'm here for. So I do want to say thanks to DICE for letting me talk about this thing that is not quite out yet or announced yet. This is also going to be talking about solving the problems unique to adding features to a shipped game, where you don't necessarily have the options to trade off the features that you've already implemented for the ones that you would like. The upside of this, as pointed out by both Mariel and Jalil, is that if there is an animation that you didn't like, you can actually change it a little bit later on. I thought of that when they said that because there was something that I did about 2.5 years ago that's been bothering me ever since in Battlefield 3, and then I was able to change it recently in Battlefield 4. I won't say what that is. So I don't want the talk to be too high level. I don't want to just talk about theories and things like that behind it, especially since many of you are already familiar with these concepts. I'm hoping that if you are, then you can at least get something out of the examples I'll be getting to later. I also don't want it to be too low level. I don't want this to be specific to EA's ANT tools and all the cool things that we get to play with, because you might not get to play with those. Sometimes at GDC there's talks that are very specific to a tool set, and it's kind of a tease. You get to see these great things that you don't get to actually use yourself unless you work for that studio. So I want to keep this as something that everybody's able to use. My mouth is really dry. Sorry. So what are additive and layered animations? I know we've mentioned this earlier, like I said, but in case anybody doesn't know this stuff, they are ways to add, subtract, and otherwise modify an animation while still preserving its original integrity. These are the basics, but the talk isn't going to make a lot of sense if you don't know these parts, so bear with me for the overview. I don't want to leave anyone behind. Back in 2009 on the Reanimators podcast, we had fellow animation bootcamper Jay Hosfeld, and we were talking about a pretty extensive talk about this, about additives, layers, and all that. And we were talking about it as the future of games animation in 2009. Jay's a smart guy. The future is now. So layers are nothing new to traditional animation, from acetate sheets and later on the Disney's multiplane camera. It's the same principle as Photoshop, except in motion. Each frame is an image. They can add more characters, effects, spots on Dalmatians, or whatever. It's also not that new anymore in 3D content creation software like Max and Maya, allowing animators to make very sloppy source files ever since. So it's increasingly fundamental in the animation middleware and game engines, as you've been seeing. What is a state machine? Again, this is the basics for those of you who aren't familiar with them. I'll get past this soon enough. It's a device that stores the status of something at any given time and the triggering input conditions for each transitions between states. Any programmers out there who are wincing at my definition, I'm speaking to animators mostly, so this is not precise, but the example might make a little more sense. So it's basically how you get from state to state in an animation. What happens when the character is just standing there? What happens when you press the jump button? What happens if you're running and you press the jump button? How animations go from which state to which state, and what happens in between. I'll also refer to this as a state flow sometimes, just because that's what I'm used to calling it. Unlike an animation blend tree, which has been kind of the previous cutting edge animation technology, state machine or state flow allows connections between any nodes, not just the branches above and below it. So this is a simplified version to illustrate a point. For those of you who work with animation state machines, this might look more familiar. a big tangled mound of spaghetti connections between nodes. And it was suggested to me that I actually find a screenshot of a real one, and that's surprisingly hard to do. Not a state machine, but in the context of animation, because they're always with proprietary tools. So this might be a little more appropriate to my talk. What is it's layers of spaghetti nodes connecting meatballs covered in a layer of marinara, and over that a layer of cheese. I think I was hungry when I made these slides. Why does this matter to games? In the Xbox and PlayStation 2 era, a game might have 20 to 80 animations per character. This, of course, depends on the genre, but in my experience, only extremely complex main characters like Spider-Man would exceed these counts, and only then because of advanced combat, web swinging, wall and ceiling crawling, very unique locomotion to Spider-Man. So we might have, idles and fidgets, directional movement, all that stuff. In this era, we were very flexible. The upsides of this were that we could go with unique keyframed animations per character. There was no need to share skeletons. We could go nuts with the characters. In a game like Spider-Man 2, every character had a unique skeleton and a fully hand-keyed animation set. There's probably 20 to 30 plus characters, a 2-year dev cycle, and just 2 to 4 animators, including James Zachary sitting right there, who'll be speaking on Friday. So higher, in the PS3 and Xbox 360 era, which is basically what we're still in, sort of, higher character fidelity requires better animation fidelity, but those require not only a higher quality of animations, but a higher quantity to bridge all those different states. More complex state flows mean transitions become less optional, and that can lead to exponential growth in animation scope. There's also a lot of potential here for what David was just talking about. Animation teams can be several times the size of last generation, and still the concept of unique skeletons and animations per character is incredibly daunting. Layers can simplify these state flows by isolating parts of a character or certain behaviors. Layers can also give some game states life procedurally, like having a base body layer, an upper body layer, arms layer, a head layer, and even an eye look at layer. So the upside to all this progress is it's a pretty big upside. Our games look and move better than ever without compromising on responsiveness. The downside is the complexity and the expense. The amount of work is now less forgiving of experimentation and iteration. More sharing of animations is often required. And just so everybody knows, I am talking about the AAA games here. This is not meant to be like to the exclusion of indie stuff. Obviously, this doesn't all apply to all kinds of games. So the biggest downside is that we lose one of the most important elements of animation, character personality, through unique body type, body language, and motion. Personality. And most often, variations of skeleton and thus different characters and body types quickly become out of scope. A cast like this would be no big deal back in 2004, but for all the advances of technology, 10 years later, this is actually terrifying. But there are all kinds of cool tech solutions that will help us take this power back. So that leads to the real focus of my talk, which is a case study in using layered animation to solve a real production problem that we couldn't just brute force animate our way out of. So a little introduction to the Battlefield 4 animation system. There are many layers running concurrently, both in first and third person. There's full body layers, upper body layers, arms, and weapons only. They play when needed, prioritized and separated from what they might conflict with. We have animation families or weapon types based on general weapon type. Families that would share a similar posture and grip, for example, rifles and shotguns would use the same stance, pistols would have their own stance, rocket launchers, bags, things like that. Animations stream in to allow for maximum variety. We have those base types, and then at 64 players at any given time, or less on last-gen console, will be loaded in, but there are more weapons than that in the game. We solve that problem by having only 64 loaded at a time. First-person animations are mostly uniquely authored, sharing family behavior like sprinting and vaulting, but most of them are completely unique. In third person, it's the opposite. It's a more robust animation set, and so most of those are shared animations and then pose-corrected additively. The exceptions are reloads and bipod animations, which are specific to each gun. But those are the only things made specifically for third-person weapons, specific third-person weapons. This is how the guys in Stockholm made sure that Battlefield 4 had a lot of variety and left room for more premium weapons. You can find out more about this methodology in a 2011 talk on the GDC Vault called Animation Methodology for Battlefield 3. That's the foundations of our current system. And it's a great system, and one size fits most. But what happens when design asks for something that doesn't fit that mold? Designers don't always play within the box, nor should they. Now, before we get to the good stuff, remember this is not a press release. I do have special permission to talk about this, and it'd be silly to ask a room this big to keep a secret, but it would increase the chances of future talks like this if this doesn't get out as a release kind of thing. So for the Urban Combat themed Dragon's Teeth expansion pack, they asked for a ballistic shield. This is a cool idea, have a ballistic shield from which you can shoot behind with a selection of handguns. Now, this may not sound like a big deal, but remember, the game is already shipped. Like I said, weapon families or types exist in some configurations, but in all those configurations, the left hand is either anchored to the weapon or free. When it's anchored to the weapon, the left hand is arcade, there really isn't any provisions to hold something big and heavy in your left hand. So shield plus anything would be a whole new animal. What would we even base it on? So we were assessing the risks at this point as it was asked for. The initial estimate was 4 to 6 weeks to get it to alpha quality. I was optimistic, perhaps foolishly so. The risks, of course, were animation, memory, design, balance, UI, but we were really focusing on the animation risks because that was first. That might have been a mistake. Was it worth the time and effort? Of course, it's hard to say until you've put in the time and effort. One risk is asset archaeology. The LA studio we are a DICE studio under Stockholm, but Stockholm is working on their own projects, and we own Battlefield 4. So those guys are busy, and I can ask them questions, but I'm the one doing all this work. So I didn't set up the system, and so I don't know it as intimately as they do. Can we match the existing quality bar for animation? Basically, we have to add something that fits in memory, and we can't degrade the quality of any existing asset. So we were all new to doing premium content and not necessarily aware of the risks. So several approaches would be attempted. The first was the old-fashioned way. This is a full bespoke animation set with the weapon and shield as a weapon type. It would be based on existing source files, so we wouldn't be creating everything from scratch, and it would match up with the existing game as close as possible. It would be a unique suite of hundreds of animations to handle the new weapon type. That actually turned into a change list of over 1,000. And especially with the desire to combine different pistols and the shield, it made the most sense to make it a new base level item. This is the old way, but for this kind of thing it was still the best, especially considering the asset archaeology element. We knew we could just copy an existing example and make everything work. And it worked. The shield set was about 90% working at this point. Code and design still had their work to do, but we were feeling pretty good about it. Just needed a little bit more time to polish. And memory. We didn't have enough memory. Christian's talk. I'm glad that other people are experiencing this, and it's a good sales pitch for Gen 4 consoles. The more people buy those, then the less we have to worry about that stuff until we fill up that memory. So it added about a megabyte, but a megabyte on 2006 era Gen 3 console hardware is a lot. So that didn't work out. We were working in the margins already for Gen 3, and it just wouldn't fit. So the second approach was using layers. How could we do the exact same thing, except cheaper? We would add a corrective layer to the existing animation set. So now we're trying to solve all the same problems, but additively with a few special conditions. Running just above the base layer of the pistol set, this would additively correct every pistol-specific pose and animation to be a shield and pistol animation, or pose. The layer would activate only when a shield was present, but that didn't really save us that much cost. The design didn't change at this point. So rather than add a new base set, we would add a correction layer that played over the weapon. It would correct every pistol pose with a pistol and shield pose. We had to determine whether a one-to-one layer is what we needed here, as you would see in the blue lines here. It would mirror the base animation state exactly. Every state on the base level would have a corresponding shield level. Or if we could use something like this purple layer here that simplifies the whole thing and adds one pose over all the different states. The hopefully edge cases where additive wasn't an option is where we would put in bespoke animations. So this guy here is modded reference. He is our internal geometry that we use to make sure nobody cheats on deformations. And this is what the base pistol layer looks like in motion. This is basically what we needed to correct on the base layer with the new shield layer, which lived right above it. I unfortunately wasn't able to get the shield captures because the animation database for Battlefield 4 is a live environment, and I risked breaking stuff by going back and recovering that. I might be foreshadowing where this talk is going. So this layer was easy to correct with some new aim poses and a new bespoke sprint. It was standing crouch only, prone, which is normally possible in Battlefield. We decided to just block. You wouldn't be able to go prone when you had a shield. We decided that was going to be unfair. It was possible, but if you lie down on the ground and put a shield over you, that's probably pretty annoying to everybody else. So these are what the corrected poses look like. On frame 1, you see what the pistol would look like with the shield still attached. Frame 2 is what it looks like with the shield and pistol in the correct pose. Aim left would have the same thing. We would have the same thing for up down, up left, up right. Basically the whole delta, pretty much the exact same thing that Jay showed with aiming. So on the second working version, the layers started to look something like this. A simplified layer with a few special cases. Sprint couldn't work additively because of the item in each hand element. That didn't actually look too bad on most of the locomotion set, that the left hand was still anchored to the right hand, and the shield and the pistol were moving concurrently, but when you put it in sprint, it all fell apart. The shield would clip through the body really bad, and them being anchored together was a lot more obvious. We tried other sprints from other weapon types, but it still looked terrible. Still, we were additively correcting a big chunk of the game's animation at a pretty low overhead. So you noticed in the last video he didn't look up and down. That exists on a different layer. That required more work, but nothing too complex. Basically, to make sure that the poses were being additively added 100% correct the same way that the regular aim poses were, the up and down aim poses, is that on the aim up and down layer, we created an offshoot state flow for the shield. This one was exactly parallel, almost exactly parallel. So instead of standing aim, we would have shield standing aim. It would go through all the same things and apply the poses the same way. If shield equals true, the aim layer would branch off into this state. And again, we had provisions to turn off should a full body animation play. Everything was being done with memory in mind. We were working optimization minded. We were fairly close to our memory target even before we'd gone in and cleaned everything up. By adding more state flows, we were adding to the always-on cost versus the weapon-specific cost, though the cost was much, much less than before. We were saving a lot on animation clips, but we were adding a lot of poses. And this is something that I learned in this process, that poses actually are a lot more expensive than animations, even though it might only be 2 frames. You can't compress a pose. So then I got to these. These are full-body additive hit reactions with lots of motion. And the left hand comes completely off the weapon. They also existed for deaths and different postures. There's a little lesson here that they were authored in 2 different programs. Most of the animations existed in Maya, and there was some in Motion Builder. And so when it got back to that asset archaeology phase, I didn't know these existed. So we were creeping up on beta. The feature was taking a lot longer than we had planned for, and the memory cost was about to skyrocket. Basically, we were going to have to do every hit reaction in the game specifically for the shield. So approach 2 wasn't dead yet, but it was suddenly a lot scarier. And like I said, we were running out of time. It could be finished, but more expensive exceptions were most likely on the way. It would still be smaller than that 1 meg of the initial pass, but we were working in the margins. Could we minimize the animation cost by isolating the bones somehow? By doing an arms-only layer? Maybe the left arm only, excluding the fingers. There was, like I said, it was bargaining. What can we do to not compromise on the feature? By doing arms-only layers weren't too common, and so what we'd be doing is like a pistol hit react front 1 would also have a parallel animation of shield arm only hit react 1, which, as you can guess, probably turns into a nightmare of synchronization. The state flow wouldn't be any cheaper with arms only. Blend animations are more expensive than additive animations because it's all the data instead of the difference. So many layers can affect the arms in third person. What kind of weirdness might we create by doing this? How do we make sure that hit react left 2 doesn't change without hit react arm left 2 breaking? Again, we were running out of time, getting close to dev alpha, and this was just for animation. The rest of the feature wasn't tested in the UI and especially balancing. We were running out of time to react, and we needed to know if we were going to have a shield. So we started talking about what we could do to save the patient. Shield only was suggested by our weapons designer, who was increasingly sure that we were fighting a losing war, and we were probably just going to cut the whole thing. So we started talking about how we could tone down the feature. We were about to introduce a way to become bulletproof in our first-person shooter, and so this started to become a more appealing idea. We would remove the ability to use pistols, and that would remove the most complex needs for tuning and design. Basically, now all we had to deal with is shield health and deploy time. And the other major variables disappear. It solves the partial exposure problem we were finding with the pistol and shield combination, and that you could get shot from the front, but you would get shot in the arm. But from first person, there's not really a good way to register that. You just seem to get shot from the front through the shield. By doing this, there was no need for custom progression or UI to allow or forbid certain pistol and shield combinations. That had been discussed even in the beginning of this feature. We were talking about how would you reload a revolver one-handed, or how would you reload the shotgun one-handed. Would it still be fun? The original feature as designed was what we wanted, not what we ever really had. We didn't even know if that was fun. Were we bringing enough new to the table by adding the shield? Again, we were adding the ability to become bulletproof in a first-person shooter. The more we discussed it, the more the idea became appealing. We were using the shield meant helping your squad and encourages squad gameplay, which we're always eager to do. I think it's stuck. Sorry. So, this was met with a lot of resistance at first, as it was such a departure from the original design. But the more we assessed it, the more we began to agree that it was not only the best way to guarantee we could deliver the feature to quality, it was actually a better feature. The original, biggest problem was solved. Both hands were holding the same thing. The shield would now be much closer to a normal weapon in terms of cost. But we weren't out of the woods yet. So, the shield was still very much... Wow, that was fast. Okay. This is getting back to how additives were meant to help Battlefield 4 in the first place. It's still a big, bulky thing. Hit reactions were still big on my mind. Do any existing sets keep both hands locked on the gun? As it turns out, yes. The anti-tank / RPG animation set was a lot more conservative than the pistols. Kept both hands locked the entire time on the weapon and involved carrying something big and heavy. It was actually a better choice from the beginning. Aiming was the biggest problem to solve. Sorry, getting ahead of myself. My first instinct was to create the shield like any other weapon, but actually because we were using the RPG animation set, it needed to be most like an RPG. It needed to have essentially an invisible shoulder support. This is not the best way to do it, but this was the way to do it that would fit in memory. There was a point where I tried to fix this additively, but I realized we were doing a bunch of extra work just to have a cleaner rig. Aiming. Everything was working fairly well, but except for the obvious problem of if you look down, you would cut yourself in half with the shield. This is what a regular weapons aim delta looks like. This is how we fixed it. We basically just prevented you from going all the way into those poses without changing the poses themselves. Again, we were trying to keep cost minimal. As for third-person crouching, we just removed that bottom layer altogether because when you crouch, the shield is basically on the ground. That's in third person only. You can still look down in first person. A shield-specific melee was originally a stretch goal. When we switched to no pistol, it became more important to have an attack. In first person, that was solved just by replacing the fire animation that every weapon already has. In third person, fires are additive and it wouldn't work. So we created a new offshoot of the reload layer state flow in third person. Reload layer was safe because it was a full body animation that would override anything else, and there was no reloading for a shield, so it was safe. That meant no new hit reactions would be required. The shield would be treated as a gun as far as doing damage, except with a 1 meter range. It was basically a hack-in for melee without requiring any code support, and it works perfectly. It's sticking again. So sprinting, This is what sprinting looks like with just the regular RPG pose. Obviously, there's a lot of clipping going on here, so that needed to be corrected. I've mentioned sprinting before. This is what sprinting looks like when you try to correct it additively. We knew that wasn't going to work, but it was worth a shot. So we wound up splicing in its own sprint animation. It was that and a sprint stop, and those are the only full-body specific animations besides the shield bash. Climbing on ladders, most weapons go on your back when you're climbing a ladder. With the shield offset you saw earlier, this created a slight problem, but luckily there was already provisions to hide it, so that's what we did. Pointing from first person, the spotting mechanic, first and third person, that would point the left hand right through the shield. Luckily, the library of existing gadgets is pretty vast, and so this had already been fixed on the defibrillator gadget, just by disabling it. The mechanic still works. You can still spot, but your left hand won't go through the shield anymore in first or third person. Obviously, other disciplines had their problems getting this feature working, but that's their talks for some other day. So the results, it turns out that being able to stop bullets in a first-person shooter is actually a ton of fun. It encourages squad gameplay and provides moving cover for your teammates. In retrospect, shield and pistol would have looked cool but been a nightmare, not only on the dev side, but for gameplay. So we're confident it's going to include a new dynamic to the game, especially in close quarters meat grinder kind of maps like Metro and Operation Locker. The ballistic shield will be appearing in the upcoming Dragon's Teeth expansion for Battlefield 4. I don't know if we have time for questions. Do we have no time for questions? Sorry. Thank you.